Ex-religious people, what caused you to lose faith? Nothing made me lose faith in an instant. It was a slow process of one realization after another, one fallacy after another, one absurdity after another. These are all based on my experience and perspective, of course. I eventually could not hold on any longer and had to let it go. Then life started to become fuller, more enjoyable, and enlightening. I felt freer and more capable of making a positive impact on the world around me. I would say that I most closely resemble a humanist now in my beliefs and lifestyle.
It's interesting how that realization can shift your perspective over time. I had a similar moment, where I slowly started questioning some things I'd always accepted. Letting go of old beliefs opened up new possibilities and made life feel more genuine. Embracing a more humanist approach allowed me to connect with others on a deeper level. It's pretty refreshing when you find clarity like that and start focusing on what really matters.
I came to realize that the only reason I lived for God was to avoid an eternity in hell. I realized I was a hostage, forced to live a life I did not choose and that I did not want. I searched for answers, which came quite easily. Now I have a bit of peace knowing that there isn't some cosmic gunman telling me to love him or else.
It's interesting how personal beliefs can shift over time. I can relate to that feeling of searching for answers, trying to make sense of things. It can be a struggle realizing that what you believed was more about fear than choice. Finding peace in your own understanding is a big step. It feels good when you finally let go of someone else's expectations and start to really live for yourself.
Was in 5th grade, sitting in church, bored, thinking about why the heck my parents lied about Santa. Wonder what else they lied about. Hey, what if? No, that's too big of a deal, they wouldn't. All the adults take it way too seriously. But, what if? Does the thing where I look at something from a different perspective, whoa, this would be so stupid if God didn't actually exist, ha. But I know he's real because Kara, because happy face Kara, because fuck, I couldn't switch my perspective back. Even though I did try, but after a while I got older and could think about it more rationally and came to the conclusion that he really wasn't real, so I didn't need to keep trying to convince myself.
Sounds like a classic moment of realization. Sitting in a place where everyone seems to have their beliefs set, and then you start questioning everything. It's wild how kids can take a small thought and turn it into this huge deal. Eventually growing up and finding a different perspective can make you rethink a lot. A bit of a wake-up call, I guess. Appreciate how that evolves with time.
I was never that religious as a kid, but had a basic belief just because my family did and everyone I knew did. I was mostly indifferent to religion and had a don't know, don't care attitude through high school. I didn't really think about it until I went to college and actually encountered atheists and other non-believers that I started to think about it and realized that it didn't add up to me.
It's interesting how exposure changes perspective. I had a similar experience when I got to college. Met people with all kinds of beliefs and it made me question my own views. I thought I had it all figured out, but then I realized there's more to it than just what I grew up with. It's a weird journey, but important for personal growth.
I accidentally stumbled upon and then was peer pressured into joining a cult. A week later, I did some research on them and realized they were a cult. I haven't been back, but that was last week. That was 100% serious. It's not a religious cult, more of a new age philosophy / self-help kind of thing. But what really made me lose faith in them, aside from just the obvious logical fallacies, is I began to realize how their emphasis on social involvement and bombarding people with love and positivity was just their way to manipulate others into doing whatever said cult says is the correct thing to do. That said, I can see how angry / unhappy people like myself would benefit from involving themselves in a social group made up of almost across the board super nice, caring, empathetic people. It's almost like practice in being positive, The reason I joined them in the first place is I always felt great around them and thought they must be onto something.
That's an interesting experience. It's wild how easily we can get drawn into groups, especially when they seem positive at first. I get the appeal of being around caring people when you're feeling down. But yeah, when you step back and start thinking critically, it can be unsettling. Glad you figured it out before it went too far. It's a good reminder to trust our instincts when something feels off.
I read the Left Behind series, which led me to reading the New Testament. I loved the philosophy in the New Testament and started to become a really religious kid for a year or so. Then I read the Old Testament and got really confused when I kept disagreeing with a lot of what was written. I asked myself, why would God have let his holy book have something like this written in it? I started to look at my beliefs in a critical light and decided that I didn't believe a word of it. That led me to the internet and popular atheists like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss. I went through the stereotypical angry atheist phase, but when I grew up some more, I started to think more rationally about the whole thing. I still have a lot of respect for certain aspects of religions, but I try to avoid the whole thing now.
It's interesting how reading can change your perspective. I went through a similar phase when I started questioning what I believed. At one point, I was super invested in a certain ideology, only to find myself disagreeing with things I used to accept. It made me rethink a lot. I think it's good to keep an open mind and respect different views, even if you choose to step back from it all.
If you watch Bill Burr's skit about his walking away from religion, that's exactly how I felt and what I did. The illogical and irrational ways of thinking felt normal until I realized that I was basically brainwashed at a young age. Once I stepped back and looked at everything objectively, it made very little sense to me anymore.
I can relate to that feeling. Growing up, I took a lot of ideas for granted, just accepting them without question. But over time, I started to notice inconsistencies in what I was taught. Stepping back made a big difference. It was like a light bulb moment, realizing I could think for myself and explore different perspectives, instead of just following what I was told.
I used to be a passive Christian. Then a friend of mine passed away. An acquaintance posted on his Facebook wall about how he was sad that he didn't live a good life and was going to hell. That started it. Eventually, I started to realize that relationship with God, or whatever you call it, is a personal thing. All I know is that I am here, other people are here, and this world is all we have. So I just respect myself, respect others, and respect my environment. I meditate as a form of prayer, and it is mostly to find peace with the universe, which I see as the best way to get close to whatever being, if there is one, created all this.
It's interesting how events can shift your perspective. Losing a friend can make you question a lot. That Facebook post seems to have triggered some deep thoughts about life and faith. I get how realizing that spirituality is personal can be freeing. Finding that connection through meditation is a solid approach. It's about peace and respect. Sounds like you've found a way to make sense of it all in your own way.
A greater understanding of science, letting me better appreciate the complexity and yet also the simplicity of how the universe works and why things do what they do. Quantum mechanics plays a big part in that. Math in general, really. But Christopher Hitchens is the man who I owe my new mindset to. Watching his debates on religion completely removed any of the half-assed ideas in the back of my head for why God was real. And the only thing that kept bugging me for a while was the argument that something had to create the Big Bang, which I've learned is just another fallacy, since something would have had to create that something. So I choose to start at the Big Bang, and to anyone who tells me that God had to create it, I respond that Bob had to create God then, and that Sally had to create Bob.
It's interesting how ideas can shift your perspective. I remember when a friend of mine got into debates about science and religion. He was stuck on the idea that everything needed a creator. Then he stumbled on some discussions about the Big Bang and found it freeing. It was like a light bulb moment. He joked that if God made the universe, then someone had to make God. It made sense to him, and it kinda clicked for me too.
I was heavily indoctrinated in an evangelical church. However, the other kids bullied me a lot, and I realized even if God was real, that church was full of petty little people just like the rest of life. Then, over time, I started getting into arguments with my pastor and my small group leader because they didn't have any strong biblical education and often said non-canonical things that no one ever called them on, such as referencing the second or third English meaning of a word that was translated from Latin. By the time I got to HS, I studied evolution and realized that church was more than anything a social/community organization, and religion was a dime a dozen. Now, I spend my time on hobbies I care about.
It's interesting how experiences shape our views. Growing up in a strict environment like that, and facing bullying, can really make you question everything. It sounds like you found your own path by seeking knowledge and understanding beyond what was taught. Choosing to focus on your hobbies shows a shift toward what genuinely matters to you. It's cool that you moved on and found what really resonates.
Our car broke down on the freeway with my mom driving and me and my brother in the car. It was around 6, rush hour, and we all could have been killed. I remember hearing my mom talking to a friend who helped us out, while there really must have been someone looking after us, so we didn't get hit. Her friend replied, "Well, if there was someone looking after you, why did you let your car break down?" That is what ultimately made me lose my faith. I was only 9 years old.
That's a tough situation to go through at such a young age. It's interesting how moments like that shape our views. Your experience with your mom and brother in the car could be terrifying. Losing faith over events like that makes sense, especially when you're just a kid trying to make sense of things. Life's randomness can be hard to deal with, especially when you expect some kind of protection.
I watched a very important woman in my life get struck down for the 3rd time by cancer. She didn't survive this last time. If anyone deserved heaven, it was her. But no God could have hurt someone so loving and religious as she. Even as she knew she would die, she kept telling everyone it would be all right, that God just wanted to see her a little sooner. The pain is still very real.
That sounds really tough. Losing someone you care about is never easy, especially when they have such a positive outlook despite their situation. It's a testament to her strength that she stayed hopeful until the end. It can be hard to process that kind of loss, and it takes time to heal. Remembering the good times can help, even if the pain lingers.
I never had it to begin with. I was raised up Catholic in an Irish-American household. I read the Bible early and spent my teenage years doubting, because it was so absurd. I spent years studying religious texts, looking for some tangible evidence of a God, but found only the apologist explanations why God does nothing. When I was 19, I knew more theology than most priests. When I moved out of my folks' house, I stopped going to church. I openly identified with the atheist movement for a long time until I saw how most were acting like the assholes we poked fun of in the religious community. Right now, I still don't believe in any deities, but it would be cool if the Norse pantheon was real, Odin rocks.
That sounds like quite the journey. Growing up with strict beliefs can shape how you view everything later on. It's interesting how you explored different ideas and ended up not really fitting into either camp. The Norse pantheon does have a certain appeal, though. It's kind of refreshing how you can appreciate the stories without taking them too seriously. Just finding your own path is what matters in the end.
It was a process for me. I was raised Catholic, and I honestly feel like the church I was raised in doesn't exist anymore. I'm grateful for the time I had as a Catholic, and that has been my foundation for social justice. But I didn't feel like I could be morally okay with staying in a religion where child abuse is covered up, where women don't get equal roles, and where you can be told to not take communion if you were gay or divorced. I just couldn't do it anymore. The last time I was in a church was for my grandfather's funeral. I don't see myself ever going in one again.
It's interesting how our beliefs can change over time. Growing up in a certain environment shapes us, but sometimes that environment doesn't align with who we've become. It makes sense to step away when something feels wrong. Your experience with the church reflects a broader struggle people have with established institutions. It's tough to let go of what we once held dear, especially in times of loss, but it seems like you've found clarity in your decision.
I actually attended Catholicism classes and was an altar boy for the church every week. I started to see a lot of contradictions and ridiculousness unraveling whenever I asked the priest questions in class. I soon learned that it wasn't really an environment that was friendly to people that were inquisitive about the Bible. Everywhere else, I was encouraged to seek knowledge and ask questions in order to learn new things, but I was shot down constantly. In church, many of the teachings/stories just didn't hold up to scrutiny. And it wasn't like the priest didn't know what he was doing either. He was a super smart guy, fluent in 4 languages, and had a few theology degrees from universities domestic and abroad. He just couldn't stand me questioning his faith. I came to the conclusion that a lot about religious faith is truly just that, blind faith. Proof isn't required. I couldn't stand it, so I just quit.
It sounds like you had quite the experience. Being an altar boy and then questioning the beliefs you were taught must have been tough. It's interesting how some places push for curiosity while others shut it down. You learned a lot about the difference between faith and evidence. It makes sense you'd step back after seeing those contradictions. Sometimes walking away is the best choice for your own growth.
Noah's Ark. It just seemed the most patently absurd story in the Bible. Everything about it, the timing of when it's supposed to have happened, the supposed size of the boat, the fact that every single animal is supposed to be on it, the explanation of where rainbows come from, all of it just defies any sort of logic. Like, even more than all the other stuff in the Bible. I realized that it was essentially the equivalent of all those how the animal got its feature stories. It's just a myth to explain something that people didn't understand that got passed down verbally and warped over the course of generations. Once I accepted that I had to accept the Bible wasn't infallible, what I had been raised to believe, and from there it was just like dominoes with one belief after another coming down.
I get what you mean. It's like when you start questioning one thing, it leads to everything else. A friend of mine had a similar experience with some stories from his upbringing. He was really into those tales as a kid but eventually realized they didn't hold up. It was kind of liberating for him, letting go of the weight of those beliefs. Now he sees them more as folklore than truth.
I lost religion, but I didn't necessarily lose faith, if that makes any sense. I guess the appropriate term would be deist, rejecting the trappings of established faith, but still accepting the notion of a higher power or powers. It didn't happen all at once, of course. It was a steady erosion caused by a never-ending series of events, acts of hypocrisy, self-contradiction, the perpetual us versus them mentality, that kind of thing.
I get that. It's like going through a phase where you start questioning things. For me, it was friends talking about their beliefs and how it didn't match their actions. It just made me think about what I really believe. You can still find meaning without sticking to one tradition. It's about finding your own path, even if it looks different from what you grew up with.
I was raised in a religious family. It never really made sense to me, and I slowly drifted away from it. The last straw was hearing someone point out that the only difference between a cult and a religion is popularity. Based on my own beliefs and biases, which were shaped by society, cults are weird and full of crazy people. Religions are normal and full of decent people even if you don't totally agree with them. However, I realized that I could find no logical basis to differentiate between the two or to place any given belief system in one category or the other. If I can't say for sure what is crazy and what is not, how can any of it make sense? I concluded that I would never be certain about what the truth is and made peace with that.
I get what you're saying. Growing up in a strict environment can make you question a lot. When you start comparing things like cults and religions, it really puts your beliefs to the test. It's tough to find a clear line between what people accept as normal and what's considered weird. Coming to terms with uncertainty can be freeing, though. It sounds like you found a way to be okay with not having all the answers.
At first, the stuff my teachers and pastors said didn't make sense, and when I questioned them, I got into trouble for it, or I was told I was disturbing the peace and sent out the classroom. When I asked other kids about it, they said to believe in God because they didn't want to go to hell. To me, that was the real WTF moment. I didn't need anyone telling me that in order to get to heaven, I needed to be a good person or follow a bunch of kind of stupid rules that didn't make sense. At the time I was in 6th grade, people dismissed my questions and disbelief as me buying a teenager, or me trying to be edgy. Anyway, I just really want to be an all-around good person and really just make an impact on people's lives, even the smallest thing, as long as they are happier than when they met me. And I really don't need some bearded wizard that lives in the sky to tell me that.
I get that. Questions are often discouraged, especially when they challenge the norm. It's frustrating when you just want to understand things better but end up getting pushed away. It's cool that you just want to be a good person and make a positive impact. Sometimes, that simplicity is really what matters. You don't need anyone telling you how to be kind. That seems like the right approach to me.
When I was 17, my mom and I were checking out a local community college. I saw someone's t-shirt that had the no symbol over the word God. We felt offended, but it got me thinking. I eventually went online and looked at the opposing side. I researched what I didn't want to know, and I've been agnostic since.
It's interesting how a simple t-shirt can spark a change in perspective. That experience led you to explore ideas you initially disagreed with. It sounds like it was a pivotal moment in your life. Sometimes what offends us prompts deeper thinking and self-discovery. It's cool to see how those moments can shift our beliefs.
Critical thinking. In all seriousness, I read the Bible, and the more I read it, the less I wanted to believe in God. And the more I thought about it, the less sense everything made. Finally, I just decided that whether there was a God or not, I wasn't going to practice any religion. And over time, I guess I just stopped believing in any kind of higher power.
That's an interesting journey. Sometimes questioning things leads to a clearer personal path. It's pretty common for people to drift away from traditional beliefs as they reflect more critically. Each person's relationship with faith or spirituality can change over time. It's all about finding what makes sense for you, I guess.
I was never a super religious, but I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic grade in high school, and I did believe. When I was 20, my very religious aunt died of cancer that had gone into remission and come back several times, leaving behind 4 kids ages 8-ish to 16-ish. At her wake, they had her diary out while she was going through everything, and I randomly opened to a page that said something along the lines of, "God, I know and accept that you do everything for a reason, but why me?" For weeks, I just could shake, why would a God that loves us do that to someone who loved God unconditionally to put her and her family through all this? And then just one day it clicked because God isn't real. 14 years later, and there has never been a moment where I've doubted my lack of faith.
I get where you're coming from. Losing someone close can really shake your beliefs. It's tough to reconcile faith with the harsh realities of life. That diary entry must have been a lot to process, especially in that moment. It's interesting how experiences can lead to questioning everything we've been taught. Sometimes, clarity comes from the hardest situations. Everyone has their own journey when it comes to belief and faith.
I was 13 lying in bed one night when I thought, why do I believe in God? I realized I did because my mother told me there is a God. I then realized that most people of different religions also are only that religion because they were taught that as a child. I then thought, is there any evidence why my religion is right and others are wrong? Then while thinking about any reason why mine was right, I realized that there is no evidence for any religion. For a while, this was very depressing for me, but it doesn't bother me anymore. I also didn't tell anyone in my family until college.
It's interesting how you can realize that beliefs often come from upbringing. I had a similar moment at some point. Just looking around, it seemed like everyone had their own reasons, mostly tied to family. It did mess with my head for a bit, you know? I kept quiet about it too. Eventually, I found my own way to think about things, and it felt less heavy after a while.
I'm gay. At first I thought I could hold on to my own personal beliefs in a God, but my parents repeatedly used religion against me and used it to reject me and attempt to change who I am. That was the beginning of a long and painful process in which I realized I don't see a place for myself within the church or as a person of faith in the future. It's not a place I fit anymore, but it was an important part of the first 17 years of my life, so it was hard to let go of.
It's tough when something that was a big part of your life turns into a source of pain. Realizing you don't fit into that space anymore can be really hard, especially when it comes from people you care about. Finding acceptance on your own terms takes time, but it sounds like you're on a path to discovering who you truly are. It's an important step to prioritize your own happiness and identity.
If I had to pick one defining moment, the last time I prayed to God and really truly meant it, asking for help, was the night my mom died. I prayed that she would be okay, at least wake up so I could talk to her one last time, but nothing. That's pretty much what ended any idea in a form of God and really made me switch my focus to just believing in myself and what I can do a little more.
That sounds really tough. Losing a parent is never easy. It's understandable to feel like that moment changed your perspective on faith. Sometimes, hard experiences push us to rely on ourselves more. It's a significant shift, and it makes sense to want to find strength in what you can control. Moving forward can be a long process, but focusing on yourself is a step in the right direction.
It didn't happen quickly. I went to a religious high school and began to learn more about Christianity. I read the entire Bible, learned Christian history, and studied the beliefs of the major Christian denominations. The more I learned, the more it sounded unbelievable. Religion had always been a background thing, something that mattered mostly on Sunday and holidays. As I began to study more, I began to use critical thinking on my own personal beliefs. It also didn't help that I'm queer and that most of Christianity is not supportive of that. My religious beliefs were gone by the time I was a senior in high school.
It's interesting how education can shift your perspective. For me, exploring different viewpoints often leads to questioning what I once accepted. I had a friend who went through something similar, diving deep into philosophy and faith. It ended up pushing him away from traditional beliefs too. It's a journey, realizing what fits and what doesn't, especially when personal identity comes into play. Life doesn't always align with what we are taught.
When I was growing up, I didn't really choose to be religious. It was mostly the people around me taking me to church and whatnot. Therefore, I was never religious by my own will. Thus, my faith started to deteriorate to a point where I no longer believe it. Life's a lot more enjoyable, in my opinion, without faith, but each to their own, of course.
It's interesting how belief can be a product of environment rather than personal choice. I had a similar experience with friends who were really into their faith. For me, stepping away felt freeing. It allowed me to explore life without the constraints that came with it. Everyone has their own path, and it's cool to see how different perspectives can lead to a more enjoyable life.
Being in a conservative Catholic school for 9 years, I realized that any type of analysis or questioning as to why things are as they are in the Bible is completely forbidden. I remember I got in trouble for asking a question because I genuinely wanted to know the reason behind something, not just to mock our teachings. I was immediately punished. That is when I realized that religion is limiting your own logic and that the church grows off ignorance.
It's interesting how a place meant for learning can shut down questions. I had a similar experience in school where asking why seemed dangerous. It felt like curiosity was not welcomed. I get how that could lead someone to feel restricted. When you're told to accept things without question, it really makes you think about the impact on individual beliefs and understanding.
I wouldn't say I am ex-religious. I used to be a Christian, but when I turned 18, my mom stopped making me go to church. So over the years, I thought about it less, and less until one day, I thought for a bit and decided no, I'm not a Christian anymore. I'd say I'm a Christian-leaning agnostic. It doesn't affect my life one way or another whether or not God exists. If God exists, that's fine. If He doesn't, I accept that. I'm not going to lose sleep over it. And it's not like I'm living a sinful life or anything. If this were Crusader Kings 2, I would have the trait sympathy for Christians, as well as brave, strong, genius, patient, diligent, lustful, and siege master.
It's interesting how beliefs can shift over time. I had a similar experience when I left my childhood faith behind. It was a gradual process, not a dramatic break. Now, I just focus on what matters in my everyday life. Like you, I don't stress about existence or non-existence. It's more about how we treat each other and navigate the world. Those traits in Crusader Kings do sum up a lot, though.
I'm not sure I would have called myself religious, but actually reading the Bible made me realize this wasn't a book inspired by God. Before I read it, I was honestly expecting to be blown away by the awesome truth inside because of what so many Christians had told me about how the Bible changed their lives or showed them how to live a good life. Of course, I'm sure there's some good lessons in the Bible, but there's also a lot of boring, violent, and sexist things too.
I get what you're saying. A lot of people hype it up, and then when you actually dive in, it's a mixed bag. You find some wisdom, but also parts that make you go, really? It's kind of eye-opening to see different perspectives, especially when you peel back the layers. It's like you start questioning what you thought was such a solid truth.
Can't believe no one has quoted, study 1 Religion, and you'll be hooked for life, study 2, and you'll be done in an hour. Anonymous, not Einstein as many people think. I did the whole Catholic school thing and loved being segregated from public school, but none of it ever made sense. I just kept thinking if your number 1 rules is have no other God before me, you must not be the real thing. Then they taught us world religions, and I kept thinking, what is the guarantee the one we are going with is the one? I never lost faith, I just never bought the whole thing to begin with.
It's interesting how those early experiences shape our views. I went to a similar school and had the same questions. The disconnect between teachings and what seemed logical was hard to reconcile. It's like they expect you to accept everything without questioning. I felt a bit like an outsider too, just always curious about the bigger picture. Sometimes it's better to keep questioning than to just accept.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.